Rabbi Phillips. And maybe, Rabbi Phillips, you could just share a little bit about your background before giving the lecture. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much all for coming. Just before I start, I want to thank Rabbi Geffen, Rabbi Schiller for helping to make this event happen. I'd like to thank Rabbi Breidowitz, who gave me some help and advice and an endorsement for the book. He's very interested in the topic of the oral tradition, how the Gemara came to be, what makes it binding, all these sorts of questions which people have when they start studying Gemara, but they don't always get a satisfactory answer to it straight away. Background. So I was born in Sunderland, in the north of England in 1984. Grew up in London. I went to sort of a range of different schools, from Hasidic to Modern Orthodox. Found my way out here to Israel in 2001. My first month here was 9/11, which was an experience. So I remember my first week in Yerushalayim, so looking out on the balcony and seeing the Knesset being evacuated by a swarm of military helicopters and thinking, something might be going on here. And yeah, I've been learning full or part-time in Yeshiva and Kollel since then. I was in Midrash Shmuel at the time. I started doing a law degree from London while I was in Yeshiva. And that really got my mind thinking, because when you're studying law from a secular perspective, it's very much how the system works. Especially at the beginning, you're trying to understand what makes something law, what makes something legally binding, how does the law change, who's authorized to change it, to interpret it. And I was learning that in the evenings while I was studying Gemara most of the rest of the day, and I kept thinking, well, how would I answer these questions in terms of Gemara and Jewish law? There must be a system. Every legal halacha is a legal system. It's a lot more than that as well, but it's a legal system. So there must be basic rules which govern how it works. And it really bothered me. I asked people, I looked around, until I struck gold, I came to the Rambam's Hakdama to the Mishnah, his introduction to the Mishnah. And the Rambam sets out how all of these things work. And it was very comforting for me to know that for someone like the Rambam, these are questions that are so fundamental that you have to clarify them and understand them, not just before you start learning the Gemara, but even before you start learning the Mishnah. So if we start off with a couple of basic questions, if we say to you all, the oral tradition, where is the oral tradition from? Is it from Sinai?
Yes.
Yeah, it's good. It's not a trick question. Yeah, one of the 13 principles of faith is that not just the written text of the Torah comes to us from Moshe, but also the Torah Shebaal Peh. But what exactly is the Torah Shebaal Peh? What came via the tradition from Moshe, and what was developed through the years? For example, if I open up a Gemara here, Gemara Tainus, and I say to you all, was every word in here given over to Moshe and passed on through the age? You'd say no, it doesn't make sense. Abaya argues with Rava about that, and there are halachas regarding situations which never even applied to Har Sinai. So the idea seems to be that there were basic rules and principles that were given over to Moshe, which were then a system through which the halacha could be set up and authorized through the generations. How do you know which is what? I found very few sources that that would help me with these questions. Another question. Let's say we have a new Sanhedrin that sets up tomorrow, next week, whatever it is. There's a discussion how it can come about. I think Rav Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch, tried to set up a Sanhedrin in his day, tried to gather all the greatest Talmidei Chachomim in Eretz Yisrael at the time, get them to agree on who the greatest Chachomim were, and set up a Sanhedrin. He came pretty close, I think. There were only a few, or maybe even one, that Talmid Chacham didn't agree to it. So let's say we get a new Sanhedrin sitting, get political, sitting wherever they sit in the center of Yerushalayim, and we know the Sanhedrin have power to legislate, to revisit, to takonos, not just when it comes to Dinei D'Rabbanan, but also when it comes to Dinei D'Oraisa, droshas. So what would you say? How would you know? How would the Sanhedrin know which halachas they can revisit and change and renew, and which halachas are off limits? Presumably they can't change everything. So again, these are questions which I had, which I I couldn't really find a satisfactory answer to. So I'm going to start off reading a little bit from this introduction of the Rambam to the Mishnah, and we'll see where we get up to. So he teaches that every mitzvah, this is I've got some sources here if you want to read through the sources with me, or I can just go through it myself and translate the main parts. Every mitzvah that Moshe taught in the midbar, in the desert, he didn't just teach the what was written in the text of the Torah, the written Torah. He taught it with perusha. He taught it with its basic explanation, with its accompanying explanation. And everything the Rambam teaches, any part of this explanation that was taught by Moshe to the people, there could be no debate about. No one could say, well, I think it should change. No Sanhedrin could revisit that. V'lo nafla by machlokas. This is the shit of the Rambam, that anything that was taught from Moshe was never forgotten and can never be disputed. But anything that was not heard directly from Moshe Rabbeinu, from the Navi, and this is an important term, min ha'inyanim hamistargim mehem, from the matters which branch off. So the sort of things that were not heard from Moshe were the finer details of each mitzvah. So if we think of it as each mitzvah has a basic trunk. It's like a trunk of a tree. So the basic feature of the mitzvah. Let's say you have to sit on a sukkah for 7 days. So Moshe would have to explain the basic structure and function of a sukkah. Because if he didn't teach that, no one would know what he's talking about. So we know basically what a sukkah is, number of walls, basic sorts of heights, what the sechach is made out of. Again, basic ideas. But the finer matters, exactly what the sechach has to be made out of, how much of it has to be covered, under what conditions one's exempt from sitting in the sukkah. These are all the finer details. Those things, they were left, says the Rambam, undefined. And a system of interpretation, a system of legislation, was given over to the Chachomim to legislate to each generation by the Sanhedrin. It was the Sanhedrin that had actual binding power to make law, but the Chachomim would hoitzi dinim, they would create dinei daraisa, bisvara, with logic. This is the logic of the Gemara. Memidas hashlosh esrei hanasunas al Sinai. The 13, the art scroll call them the hermeneutical principles. That's what it's terms that everyone knows from the art scroll. The hermeneutical devices, carbonos, gezerah shava, all the different ways we look at the text of the Torah. And this system was given over to Moshe, and he taught the people how to use it. So these are details. These finer details were not taught directly to Moshe. He was just given a system through which these details could be created. And Ohr Somayach, these finer details, Shotziam, which were created by the sages and the courts of the generations, there are certain things which there was no machlokas about, aval, there are certain other things which were disputed, because when there's no, like in the Gemara, there's no answer book at the back, you can look up and see who's right. So one chacham will look at it one way and say, well, a new situation has come up, or a new detail is being discussed. Well, I will compare it to halacha A, which is mutar, and another chacham will compare it to halacha B, which is asur. And they'll bring arguments one way or the other. One will darshan the pasuk one way, one will darshan the pasuk the other way. And there's no definitively right answer at that stage. That's how you get elu ve'elu, that both are correct. Because this halacha was not given over by Moshe. Moshe gave over the system. So within these finer details, that is where the machlokas started, and this is the area within which the Sanhedrin of each generation has power to legislate and to revisit what was legislated by an earlier court. And the question comes up, this is something, I don't know if any of you are in Rabbi Reitowitz's question and answer session. I listen to it quite often. I've been, over the last few months, I've been doing some volunteering work 1 day a week on the farms, and I've got my podcast, my shiurim, which I catch up with, and one of them is the Rabbi Reitowitz's question and answer session. And I know this question has come up a couple of times. Well, why did Hashem create a system like this? We know Moshe Rabbeinu had a better form of nevuah, a more accurate, precise level of prophecy than any other prophets that will come later, and certainly a better way of understanding Hashem's ratzon, His will, than any of the chachomim that would come after the Nevi'im. So why did Hashem set up a system which is incomplete? Give over a Torah which just had the main principles and give over the details to be legislated by the courts? Why not? Hashem could have given over a system where every single detail of halacha was fixed at the time. And then we'd be practicing his pristine form of halacha where we'd know everything is right. So I don't know if you've heard his mashal. Go on.
Because according to every generation, there is a required set of halachas. Like they did halacha according to the requirement for each generation.
Very good. That's one of the answers. That's very. So before I get to that, I'll say over Bryce Witz's mashal because to me it was a really beautiful mashal. I don't know if you've heard it already. You can stop me in the middle and I'll go a bit quicker. He talked about how he gave a mashal, an example of a father who has to run a birthday party for his daughter. He's got a 6-7-year-old daughter, and what does he do? So option A, as we say in Israel, Ein Yom Holedet B'li Uga. There's no birthday without a cake. He's got to get a cake. So he can go out to the bakery and he can find her favourite book or cartoon character, find a cake which is perfectly created and sculptured with the icing, looks beautiful, she'll be delighted. Option 1, very nice. But there's something better he can do. What is that? He can sit down with her at home, find out what sort of cake she wants, go to the shop with her, get the ingredients, spend a couple of hours baking the cake together, and it's not as beautiful and pristine as the one they bought in the bakery, but what have they gained? A relationship. They've spent hours together building a relationship between them, and that, said Rabbi Breidowitz, was part of is part of the function of the Torah Shabbal Peh. It's not just we're given this set, so go and keep that. It's Hashem wants us to be toiling in the Torah Shabbal Peh, to be using our mind, to be understanding the svara, the logic of the Gemara. Why is the halacha this way? Maybe it should be that way. Why am I comparing it this way? Maybe I compare it that way. And the process of learning and the intellectual efforts we're putting in is part of a process of building a relationship with Hashem. We build an intellectual and also eventually a spiritual relationship with Hashem by studying the Torah Shabbal Peh. And that's a primary part of its function. So that's one reason why, yes, Hashem could have given us this perfect, pristine set of Torah, but that would have defeated part of the purpose of it. That's part 1. Part 2, as what's your name?
Azrael.
As Azrael mentioned, is that part of the function of the Torah Shabbal Peh. And this is something which we've almost lost touch with a little bit because we haven't had a Sanhedrin type court for so many years. And also we've had the conservative and the reform movements who sort of go overboard in trying to change halacha and without correct boundaries, without correct court or anything like that. So we've very much pulled back from this idea that halacha changes. We've sort of kept the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch, because we haven't had a Sanhedrin. But in an ideal state, when the Torah is functioning as it should be, we have a Sanhedrin there, as you said, which recognizes the needs of the generation and knows the limits and knows the system that was transmitted through the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu, and within that system can create the details of halacha to meet the needs of the generation. And I'm going to quote here from the Meshech Chochmah of Meir Simcha of Devinsk. He was writing in Germany in the 1920s, and he's talking. This is his commentary on Parashat B'chukotai. It's his commentary on the Toichachon, the rebuke, all of the terrible things that were going to come across the Jewish people if they didn't keep the Torah. And one of them is Golus, going into exile, which we had for much of our history. And what really comes out of it is that we think of Golus, think of exile, and we associate it with two things. We're out of our lands, that's a terrible thing. We have the pogroms, we have the persecution, we're all very familiar with that. But there's another aspect of Golus which we're not even so familiar with, and that is loss of control over the Torah. And he's talking about how, in this section, how the youth of the day, which is I guess the youth in the 1920s Germany, are feeling disenchanted and disconnected from the Torah. And he says, were we back in Israel in the good old days, Haloim Haya B'Eretz Yisrael Milifnim, had we been back as the system was supposed to be, in Eretz Yisrael, with a Sanhedrin, and even when it comes, even with the drashas of the Yud Gimel Midos. So the Meshech Chochmah says, we in Golus are unable, we're fixed, we're paralyzed by the halachic system which has come to us because we don't have a Sanhedrin, and that is part of the punishment of Golus. Were we back in Eretz Yisrael with a Sanhedrin as it was supposed to be, we would be able to, as you said, legislate and be metaken and create droshas according to the needs of the generation. There's a Hasidic sefer which says the same thing from a Kabbalistic perspective. It's called the Degel Machane Ephraim. He's one of the earlier Hasidic Rebbes. He talks near the beginning of his parish on the Torah. He talks about how every generation has its own shorish of neshama. Again, don't ask me exactly what these things mean. But it says the neshama, the overall neshama of each generation, the spiritual, mystical needs of each generation is a little bit different. And part of the function of a Sanhedrin is to be tuned in, to recognize the spiritual needs of the neshamas of that generation, and to create takonas and droshas in order to maximize to meet the needs of that generation. So that's a fascinating idea. There's one other source I bring also. It's called the Yad Malachi, which is a brilliant sefer of klalim, of general rules of how the Gemara, how the Rambam, how the Shulchan Aruch. It basically gives you a basic structure of how to learn them, of the different rules that apply to them. And he says under the heading of droshas that one of the function of droshas, of the hermeneutical, of the ways of mining laws out of the Torah, is nischadshu dinim lefi tzorech hazmanim. The new halachas were renewed and created according to the needs of the time, b'meshach hadoros, throughout the generations, v'kivnu b'hem l'drosha gemara, and recognizing what the generation needed, they would then create a drosha which suited that. And the big question always is, well, how much? When we're reading in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva said this based on one drosha. Rabbi Shimon said that based on another drosha. So how much is based on them looking at the words of the Torah, the system that's come, the Gezerah Shavas, the rules that have come down, and how much is based on the needs of the generation? And I guess we don't have a precise answer because many of the Mishnayos we have don't give us a full account of the motive of the Tanaim. But there's one source which we do have, which is very interesting, which according to many of the Rishonim on that sugya do deal with this, and that is it's the last Mishnah in the first chapter of Krisus. And the case that's being discussed is it's a discussion about how when a woman gives birth or has a miscarriage, before she's able to enter the Beis HaMikdash or eat from carbonos, she has to bring a certain korban. I think it's two korbanos, it's two pigeons, one chatas and one ola. And inevitably what happened is the Jewish people at definitely the time at the end of the second Mikdash, they weren't all living close to the Beis HaMikdash. Some were out in Bovel, some were a bit further away. And not everyone came each Chag, each year even, to the Beis HaMikdash for Ola Regel. There'll be people that come every 3 years. People in America now, they'll come every few years. They'll come and visit Yerushalayim for Yom Tov. And so they had these cases of these families that came in from Bovel. They hadn't been in Yerushalayim for 5, 6, 7 years. And in the intervening years, the mother of the family had either several children, several miscarriages, and she wanted to go to eat the korban of the Yom Tov, enter the Beis HaMikdash, and the question came up, well, does she have to bring just one set of carbonos for all of the obligations in the intervening period? Or does each separate birth require a separate korban? And this was something which was disputed among the Tanaim. I think Rabbi Akiva said that one set of korbanos suffices for everything because it's really a purification process. And just like going into the mikveh, it doesn't matter how many times you've come into contact with something impure, you go into the mikveh once and it purifies you. Other Tanaim, I think it was Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, said no, it's more akin to carbonos, and each time you have an obligation for a korban, you do a sin, you have to bring an additional korban. So they argued about it. The Sanhedrin sat and the Sanhedrin ruled stringently, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So suddenly, all these women had to bring multiple korbanos, and each one, I think, was a couple of birds. So what happens at the time? Okay, say better. What happens with suddenly a surge in demand for korbanos? The prices went way up. all the traders of carbonos, because it was a big time for the animal traders, bring an animal along to the Beis HaMikdash, bring your herds along to the Beis HaMikdash for the Chagim, when the crowds are coming in to bring carbonos, and you can make a killing, right? So suddenly the Sanhedrin has ruled just before Yom Tov that all these women have to bring many more carbonos, and they all put their prices right up. So Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time, he came out to Har HaBayit, he saw what was going on, and he took a shvuah. This is all recorded in the Mishnah, and he said, "I'm going to take a shvuah that we're going to deal with this. We can't have all these women that've been ola regel, and they're being exploited by the traders." And he reconvened the Sanhedrin on the spot, and they voted in accordance with Rabbi Akiva's more lenient version that one set of carbonos would suffice for everything. And instead, the price dropped by a quarter, by three quarters. So what we have here is, to me, I think Rashi said it was harasha. It was a one-off decree. But most Rishonim, this was a full decree of the Sanhedrin, and the halacha now follows this, that one set of carbonos is required for everything. But what we see here is the interaction between these two different systems. Both sides of the argument, saying that she should have to bring multiple carbonos or only one carbon, they were both reached through application of regular droshas. You had Tanoim on both sides. You had Rabbi Akiva on one side, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri on the other side, and they are both using the system of droshas, the system of the oral law, which has come down from Moshe, and reaching conclusions on that basis. Yet we also see the input of the needs of the generation, the head of the Sanhedrin going out and seeing what's happening and saying, you know what, we have to revisit and we have to rule a different way. So there's one example we have of the interaction between these two different parts. So of these two rights. So now the next question comes up. Well, how do we know? We've said we have this two-tier system within halacha, within the oral tradition. Parts of the oral tradition which are fixed, they've come through from Moshe. They are the core parts which define the basic function of the mitzvah. They can never be a machlokas over them. They can never be disputed. They can never be changed. No Sanhedrin can never change any of this. And then there's this second section of halacha, which he called the inyanim hamistargim, the finer branches, the finer details, which were handed over, they were delegated, almost left open to the chachomim of each generation to legislate via the courts. And those things were deliberately left open to be defined according to the needs of the generation, to build this connection. I brought more sources on the sheet here. Hilchas Mamrim, the beginning of chapter 2 of the Rambam, he talks out explicitly how if Sanhedrin sits down and darshans, creates a new halacha via one of the midos, a new halacha doraisa, and the next generation, the Sanhedrin come along and the niroloi tamacher, they understand something differently. This second court can, I think even must, change the halacha according to what they see in their eyes. So we see that this is very, very important. It's absolutely crucial to know which halachas fit which category. There's an example here, there's a Mishnah Yevamis that I bring. There's a halacha which came up about Ammoni and a Moavi. There's certain nations, this halacha isn't really applicable anymore. We don't know exactly which generation is which, about Ammon and Moav. But there's a halacha that they could not, the males of Ammon and Moav could not marry into the Jewish people, even once they converted. And there was a machlokas among the Tanoim about whether this applied also to the females, Ammonis, Moavis. And Rabbi Shimon Yochai presents a kal v'chomer to the Chachamim, in order to say that it should be this prohibition should not apply to the women, and they say back to him, he presents a kal v'chomer to them. This is the halacha should be mutar. They say back to him, im halacha nekabel. If what you are presenting is a law which has been transmitted through the generations from Moshe, nikabel, we accept it. We're not going to challenge halacha which has come all the way through from Moshe. We can't. That's beyond our power. We know that. But if this halacha you're telling us is your own creation, it's your own logical conclusion from a kal v'chomer, you've looked at the sources and said, this is what seems right to me. If that's the case, yesh teshuvah. We don't find your kal v'chomer so binding. We have a pirucha, we can override it, and therefore we're not going to accept what you say. Loi ki halacha ani omer. He says, no, what I'm telling you is a tradition that's come through the generations, and if you look at the halacha books, that was the accepted halacha, and that is now the halacha as it came to us today. So it's absolutely crucial for us to know and to determine which halachas we have, especially if we're looking to set up a Sanhedrin again one day, but even in terms of learning the Gemara, and I'll show you in a minute why, awareness of these two different categories when you're learning Gemara opens up so much. It helps you understand so much of what's going on in the Gemara. Any questions before we start? I'll give an example of the mitzvah of Kriat Shema, but any questions before that? Okay. So the mitzvah of Kriat Shema is a pretty popular one. We do it a couple of times a day. And as far as we all know, mitzvah Kriat Shema is d'oraisa. We keep it, it's written, we have the psukim written in the Torah, we have to say these words, we have to teach these words, we do them b'shachbacha in the evening when we lie down, and again v'kumecha in the morning when we rise up. As far as we all know, and this is the halacha as we have it, the Kriat Shema is d'oraisa. However, when we learn through the sugya, the part of the Gemara which deals with these things, suddenly it doesn't seem so clear. The source here in Brachos 21a, Omar of Yehuda taught, Sovik Kara Kriat Shema, Sovik Loi Kara. So you're getting in late at night, you've been to a wedding, you're lying down in bed, and suddenly, did I say Kriat Shema or not? Did I daven Marva? I can't remember. It was such a busy day, we were dancing, we were eating. I cannot remember if I'd said Kriat Shema or not. You're not obligated on the basis of this doubt to go and read again. The continuation says, my timer. What is the reason? Kriat Shema d'Rabbanon. Teachers of Yehuda, the mitzvah of Kriat Shema is rabbinic. And as we know, when you have a sophic, when you have a matter of doubt in rabbinic law, we are lenient, we go l'kula, as opposed to d'oraisa, sophic d'oraisa, we have a matter of doubt in Torah law, we're stringent. So Rabbi Yehuda seems to be teaching that Kriat Shema is rabbinic. How can that be? We know it's written in the Torah, and that's what the Gemara challenges. Meisiv Rav Yosef says, well, how can you say the mitzvah Shema is rabbinic? Of a shachbachav kamecha. We have it there in the pasuk. You got to say these words when you lie down, i.e. the Kriat Shema of the night, of a kamecha, and the Shema of the morning. Amalei Abaya answered on behalf of Rabbi Yehuda, no. Hahu b'divrei Torah chesiv. That mitzvah of shachbachav kamecha is only referring to reciting words of Torah in general. Chirush. So that would seem to be d'oraisa, Torah law, and it would seem to be, according to Rabbi Yehuda and according to others, the specific words of Kriat Shema, the passage that we end up reciting, is only rabbinic. Well, how do we unpack all this? How do we put all this together? Based on all the principles that we've learned together so far, we have that introduction of the Rambam to the Mishnah, and he's taught us that anything which came to us from Moshe, from Sinai, there could be no machlokas over, there could be no dispute. So if we are now going to apply this principle of the Rambam to this passage of Gemara about Kriat Shema, we're forced to say that the mitzvah of Kriat Shema, at least saying over the passages of Shema that we have in our Siddur, that did not come from Moshe. That would seem to be the conclusion that we get. However, it's not so simple, because what we do find, what is undisputed, is there is some form of mitzvah to recite words of Torah, Shach B'chav Kamecha. That everyone agrees. Everyone in the Gemara agrees there's some kind of mitzvah, but not everyone agrees on the content of the mitzvah, the details, to recite specifically Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So now, if we look now at the different layers of this parasha, of these psukim and the Torah Shebaal Peh, let's see if we can build something up. So we've got the basic pshat, the basic meaning of the words of the Torah. So let's say Moshe taught them, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, v'dibarta bam b'shitcha b'eisecha v'etcha v'derech u'shach b'chav kamecha. All these words, in terms of the basic meaning, the basic pshat level, they're just telling you should be involved in words of Torah the whole time, as often as you can. Whether you're walking in the street, whether you're sitting in your house, morning, evening, Any time you have a spare moment, don't sort of sit there scrolling on your phones, but open Chumash, open a Mishnah, do something useful with your time, create a connection to Hashem in that moment. That's the general meaning in terms of pshat. However, what is undisputed, what we see from the Gemara is absolutely undisputed, is that there's also some kind of mitzvah saseh of b'shach b'chav kamecha. It's not, and specifically those two words, not when you're walking in the street and sitting in your house. There's no mitzvah to go around walking in the street every day reciting Torah. There's a specific mitzvah in the evening and in the morning to recite words of Torah. And that's undisputed. So if that is undisputed and it's a central feature of a mitzvah, we would, applying the principle of the Rambam, would say that is something which has come to us through the Masorah, through the tradition from Moshe. So what we can be pretty sure about is that there was definitely a mitzvah of b'shach b'chav kamecha to recite some words of Torah every morning and every evening. The idea presumably is to bookend your day in Torah, that even if you have a day which is very busy, you have to run around and do other things, if everything you do is bookended in the context of Torah, that has some kind of influence over your day. We have similar ideas in terms of the Beis HaMikdash, certain things which are done in the morning and the evening, bookend the day, gives a certain meaning, certain significance. What about the Kriat Shema, the way we have the mitzvah today? So this is the way I understood it, was that at some stage the Sanhedrin would have looked around and said, well, what are the needs of the generation? We think that there's a certain weakness in terms of Kabbalat Ol Malchus Shamayim, accepting the yoke of heaven, the unity of God, and therefore we are now going to fix what was previously an open mitzvah to recite any passages of Torah morning and evening. We are now going to fix this as specifically the passage of Kriat Shema. And they can do that because, as we know, as we've seen, the Sanhedrin, a fully formed Sanhedrin, an authorized Sanhedrin, have the power and authority to legislate even within Torah law. And the question of the Gemara is, do they legislate that as Torah law or rabbinic law? Without getting into the significance. When I first learned the sugya and I had these conclusions, I thought it was a bit radical. I wasn't so sure about it. And then I looked at some of the commentaries, and let's have a look here at the Pnei Yeshua. The Shakas Arias is a similar thing. And he says, on this sugya of Kriat Shema D'Oraisa and Drabonon, he says, what is the meaning? What is the intention of this sugya? He's also troubled by this idea of Kriat Shema being rabbinic. He quotes the Rabbeinu Yonah, which I couldn't find inside, but I'll take it from the Pnei Yeshua. The one that says Kriat Shema Drabonon, Hainu Mishum Demashmale. This is because it's understood by him. That the Pasuk says you recite these words in the morning and the evening. It's not that there's a requirement to recite specifically this parasha of Shema morning and evening, as in terms of the basic meaning of the Torah. Even if you were to recite a different passage of the Torah morning and evening, that would be enough. However, how the sages came along, or whatever stage it was, and I'll explain to you why I think it was sometime during the Bayis Sheni, they came along and they made a ruling at a certain stage that no, we are using our power and authority as a Sanhedrin to say, no, it's not open anymore. We want you to read specifically the parasha of Kriat Shema. Why? Because the Chachamim felt that we need to reinforce, we look at the needs of the generation, as you said, and we need to reinforce the Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim, accepting the yoke of heaven. Once the Chachamim have done that, we are now no longer able to fulfill the mitzvah in any other way. We have to read Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. If we read other parts of the Torah, we haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. And that is the power of a Sanhedrin, the power of a court. Now, why do I say this was probably done sometime during Bayis Sheni? Because there's an interesting phenomenon we have with Kriat Shema. When we have Kriat Shema, we recite every day. We don't just say Shema. What do we say along with it? Before and after. We have brachas over Kriat Shema. And what was the bracha we say just before? Normally, you have a bracha over a mitzvah. You say, normally, the bracha you have over a mitzvah relates to the actual mitzvah that you're doing. However, what do we say when over Kriat Shema? There's no Al carbonos malchus shamayim. What is it all about? B'shachavenu of kamenu, which is paraphrasing the words of the pasuk, B'shachavav of kamecha, nasiach b'chukecha. We should be speaking in your statutes. V'nismach b'divrei Torasecha. We should be rejoicing in your word of Torah. The bracha over Kriat Shema is all about Talmud Torah. The brachas of Kriat Shema, as far as we know, were formulated by the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly. This goes right back to the start of Bayis Sheni, maybe even earlier, but definitely the start of Bayis Sheni. So it would seem that at that time, when the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah were formulating the brachas of Kriat Shema, it wasn't a mitzvah of Kriat Shema, it was a mitzvah of Peshach B'chav Kamecha. And at some point, the Sanhedrin sat down and they limited the mitzvah to Shema Yisrael, Shema Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and the paragraphs with it, but they did not want to change the formula of the brachas. Maybe they weren't actually able to change. It's a separate discussion. The formula of the brachas, which Anshe Knesset HaGadolah put together, and that's why we have this. I won't call it a dissonance, but it's this little bit of a disconnect between what used to be a broad mitzvah of Talmud Torah into Kriat Shema. And to the extent that the bracha over Kriat Shema of Nasiach B'chukecha v'nismach b'divrei Torasecha, there's a discussion in halacha, and I think in certain circumstances, if you don't say your brachas HaTorah in the morning, but you do say the bracha of Ava Rabbah over Torah, you've already fulfilled your bracha over Talmud Torah, and you don't go back and recite the brachas of Talmud Torah. Again, check with the pasuk exactly when it applies and doesn't apply, because it's a bit of a complicated sugya, but there is that concept that this bracha over Shema represents a bracha of Talmud Torah. And there's one other source here, connecting the mitzvah of Kriat Shema to the basic minimal obligation of Talmud Torah. There's a Gemara I bring over the page. Amar Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So this is taught in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Afilu lo yikara adam ela Kriat Shema shachris v'arvis. Even if a person did not recite any Torah in a day except for the Shema of the morning and evening, kiyem lo yomush. He has fulfilled the obligation of not having Torah absent from his mouth. The very minimal daily obligation of Talmud Torah is represented by the mitzvah of Kriat Shema, B'shach B'chav Kamecha, bookending your day in Torah. And to me, this is an idea of how being aware of how the system of Torah Shebaal Peh works. These two different categories, things which are fixed, which can never change, which are undisputed, and come through the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu, and the finer details which were given over to the Chachamim and to the Sanhedrin to legislate. They are very important to know in terms of studying and understanding Gemara, seeing how everything fits together. And they will also be, Be'ezrat Hashem, when we have a Beis HaMikdash and a Sanhedrin and everything very soon, the first thing the Sanhedrin will need to be able to determine is which parts of halacha they have the authority to change. For example, Kriat Shema, according to what we've seen, the Sanhedrin will be able to sit and say, well, our generation, we're fine on carbonos, malchus shamayim, we're fine accepting the yoke of heaven, but we need to strengthen a different area of avodas Hashem. Therefore, they could change or they could add other parts of the Torah to the mitzvah of Kriat Shema. But they would never be able to come along and say, we're going to change the mitzvah to be 3 times a day, or once a day, or not at all, because the basic structure of B'shach B'chav Kamecha being a mitzvah to recite Torah morning and evening, that is something which we know has definitely come through from Moshe, and that's something which no one could ever change as part of the oral tradition, which is off limits even to a fully authorized Sanhedrin. So yeah, that's just an example from the first section of my book of how awareness of the basic underlying principles of Gemara and Torah Shebaal Peh can really open up and change the way you learn Gemara. Yeah, thank you.